Welcome to the Powerful Panels podcast. This is Kristin Arnold, and I am a leading authority on moderating panel discussions, and I am on a quest to make all panel discussions lively and informative. And I am so excited because today we have on our podcast my friend and fellow professional speaker, Brian Walter, who has been with me on this journey, I think, since I started this in 2014. Now, Brian is the president of two companies. When I met him, it was just one, Extreme Meetings. Like, he runs the most amazing experiential meeting things that just blow the audiences out of the water. And recently, do I have this right, Brian? Recently, it's sticky training. So we were having this great conversation about sticky training. And I'm like, well, what about sticky panels? And his eyes lit up. Because in both of these roles, he supports his meeting planner, organizers, directors, producers as an engagement and interaction expert. So this is my favorite part. Brian loves panels just like I do. Loves it. So I wanted to invite him to be on our podcast to discuss this notion about what makes a panel sticky. Obviously, earbuds don't stay in your ears, so they're not sticky.
I love the metaphor you're using for sticky and non-sticky with your earbuds.
Sticky.
Yes.
I love that. I want to talk about what makes a panel sticky. I want to talk about what are some extreme panel techniques, and many of them Brian has gracefully let me have in my book, 123 Ways to Add Pizzazz to a Panel Discussion. So shout out to the great Brian Walter.
And to the great book that's kind of like the Bible of panels.
Shit.
I don't know if it's like, divinely inspired, but Kristin inspired. So,
Well, it was inspired by a lot of people. You, first and foremost, but a lot of people helped put that book together. But I want to warn the audience, Brian is a corporate humorist. So there's a good chance that he'll be a little irreverent. Or I'll be a little bit irreverent. So welcome, Brian, to the show.
Woo, thank you. The panel show. Powerful panels.
The Powerful Panels podcast. Yes. So let's start at the very beginning, which I hear is a very good place to start. Let's talk about what makes a panel sticky. Like, you're into the sticky world right now. What makes a panel sticky? What makes it have legs? What makes it be buzzworthy in the hall?
What makes something sticky is that there is at least one or a few big moments that go verbally viral for the rest of the event. Right there, that is the stickiest thing. Now, we can get into, and we will get into a lot of the details here, but we know, that was an amazing speaker. And, because she blah, 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 blah. Or when we broke the boards in half, that was amazing. And people cried. They rarely say that about panels, which is sad.
Well, a lot of panels, not your panels nor my panels.
Yes. But it's like that's more like a unicorn sighting a panel type of thing. And so when I say when a panel is sticky, when people are buzzing about a panel, is because there was a big moment or two where when she said blah, when they were tussling about X, and it was surprise. People were spilling. It wasn't like people were sharing information about trends, but no, it's like they told us the real deal on X. And it's like, I can't believe they said that. And when people are saying they shared the real deal, they gasped. They said, I can't believe that they actually told us that. That's where the aha value of panels show their amazingness, I think. And that's when people say, that panel was amazing.
Amazing. They won't say it's sticky, but that's what actually happens. If they're saying it's amazing, and they're repeating things that happened in that panel, and that's not going to happen without some intentionality. I mean, I think panels are kind of like on this autoplay that, people just regurgitate what they've seen done before. And that's
why they need to read your book.
It's not powerful. It's not lively. It's not sticky. It's not awesome. It's not amazing. It's like, okay. But is it worth people's time to sit in the seat, listen to the panel, either virtually or face-to-face, and did they get something that they can't already get off of YouTube, ChatGPT, Google, or, read a blog or something, right?
Well, yeah, and then that's the key thing, is that those who I presume are listening to this podcast now are the people who are going to be producing panels or hiring people to produce panels for them or managing people producing panels for them, because, panels is, I like to say, is the go-to format for meeting organizers when they're not sure exactly what they want. Meaning, like, we've hired a keynoter to do X. We've hired, an MC to do Y. We're going to do a breakout session. We're going to have, Mary Schmedlap, the vice president of sales, talk about this. Like, organizers knows how to do those things. But then suddenly it's like, we need something different here. So what if we put a bunch of super cool, respected people together and ask them questions and hope magic happens?
Hope is the 4-letter word, right?
Hope, and that's what I did. Like, it is like, and what the deal is, it's like, now the reason they do that is because every once in a while, it totally works. But, and this is why people need to buy your book and also try different techniques, is that you can make that dramatically more likely to happen, that rare amazing panel could be a likely amazing panel by putting in craft and technique. But too many meeting organizers are just going to presume that if we put cool people together, the panel will be amazing. And the answer is, well, not necessarily. In fact, not usually. But if you help them, it will.
And a lot of that stems on the meeting organizer selecting a skilled moderator to pick those techniques.
Indeed.
But also, it's really about having great panelists, as you were saying, that are going to share some insights and wisdom that the audience cares about versus, well, we really need to have this sponsor represented. We need to really have this big wig represented. And so sometimes you get into that kind of panel where even if you have so panelists and a great moderator who's guiding the discussion, you can still have that amazing, extreme, sticky, awesomeness panel, the powerful panel.
Exactly. And I mean, that's what we're going to be talking about here. The craft of asking questions in such a way, and the frequency of questions and the pacing of questions, so that people will spill. Because that's what the people want, is like, they spilled. She told us, he told us that thing. Because when you put people on, there's a reason you put people on these panels. They have expertise, they have the history, they have the knowledge, but they're not just naturally going to give out the great stuff. But my favorite part is when you see a panelist lean forward, you're going to get something good. To me, this is what happens. Like they're kind of sitting back, they're like this, and suddenly the moderator asks them a really good question. They go, and when this body language happens, when they lean in and go, or they turn their head, and that's the part where everyone should be like, get ready. This is going to be the good stuff. I'm going to write this down, because their body language is showing you, like, actually, that was a really interesting question. Now that you say it like that, and then they're going to share something great. So I literally like to watch panelists' body language, and when they lean in, when they touch their face, like, or they kind of cock their head, then it's going to be the good stuff.
Okay, so the corollary to this, Brian, is do you tell the panelists what questions you're going to ask, or at least the format, the structure that you're going to use?
Mostly, yes. Mostly, not everything. Because again, my whole thing is that you want to leave room for magic. But magic happens because you're doing the trick the way it's supposed to work.
I love that. I love that metaphor.
I know. I'll give you an example. Here's a story. I once worked with a speaker magician who was amazing. He's a motivational speaker magician type of thing. And so I had seen his trick a number of times. And he had one trick where he called a bunch of volunteers up, and he said, okay, do you know how to shuffle cards? And she would say yes, and she would shuffle cards, and he would have her pull one. And then eventually you'd say, is that your card? Typical type of thing. I've seen him do this. Then suddenly he's doing a thing for Microsoft, kind of important audience. He gets a volunteer and she comes up. He said, can you pick a card? Yes. Put it back in your deck. Do you know how to shuffle? She said, yes. She went to shuffle and the deck exploded all over the stage. He looks down. Audience looks down. This is not supposed to happen. Audience like, oh my gosh. And he's gathering up the cards and he's kind of talking. He's like, okay, is that your card? She says, no. And he goes, oh, okay. Well, I didn't say it was your card. I just want to know if that was your card. Okay. Is that your card? And she goes, no. And he's like, darn it. And the audience is like, oh no. And then Sydney goes, I'm sorry. Pulls a card out of his mouth and says, is that your card? And she says, yes. And the audience goes berserk. Afterwards, I go to the magician, we'll call him Bob. And I said, Bob, it's like, I was so worried for you when the deck exploded. And he said, when something unexpected happening, he said, that's the gift from the meeting gods. He said, because now the audience is like, this is real. This was unexpected. He said, of course I palmed the card before he ever gave her the deck to do it. And he said, and so he showed me, he said, when the unexpected happens, he said, embrace it because that's where the magic happens. So to answer your question, I leave room for magic, but as a moderator, it's also my job to protect the panelists and also to help them be their best selves in that moment. And if I don't prep them, then they're scared and they're nervous. And I ask them a clever thing and they're like, what the bleep did you just do, Brian? And that would be bad.
Okay, we're going to go through what the bleep did you just do in just a minute. But you said a critical element is preparing the panelists. So what do you do for an extreme panel?
Yes.
Not the traditional boring panel, because that is not in the same sentence as Brian Walter, right? So what do you do to help the panelists be those brilliant human beings that we know they are?
Well, first is I let them know what success looks like. Because when they are, it's like, oh, let me know the questions and I'll come up with answers. And the answers are going to come up with will usually be pretty safe traditional answers. And it's like, so like, oh, because I want to prepare them. It's like, and I usually like to first prepare them by saying, what is the best panel you have ever heard? And usually they're like, oh, I remember this one time. And I'll say, why was it? Oh, and then they'll say the same things you've been talking about. Oh, because she really told them the truth here. And so I said, okay, so when you think of what do they think the answer is, and what is an answer that you can give them that will surprise them, shock them, amaze them? Surprise, shock, and amaze, if at all possible. At minimum, it's an insight they don't know. Another thing I like to talk about them is, how long does it take before the audience hears something they didn't already know? And if the answer is the third question, okay, and that's a problem. And so when I ask them, and so I say, hey, here's a question we're going to ask. What type of thing are you going to answer? And they go, blah, 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 blah. And I'll say, okay, how much of that have they already heard of, or do they already know? Well, they know this and that. What do they not know about this? And they'll go, oh, well, I guess that would be lead with that first. Yeah. And when I say lead with that, pretty much they just focus on that. And then and also I think panelists also, they can start to feed from the audience. When the audience is really hearing things they haven't ever heard before or didn't already know, their energy is palpable and like, oh, and you see the panelists start to, because when a panelist, multiple, are giving answers that the audience hasn't heard before, the audience is really digging it. The panelists are like, this is fun. This is like, wow. And then they're going to spill even more. And it's this virtual circle of increasing candor, increasing insight, increasing surprise, and unexpected insights that escalates and makes an extreme panel.
Awesome. So I love that. Start with what the audience doesn't know, like out of gate, so that the other thing is, you said shock and surprise. And I also think that it's important to set up the panelists to recognize that disagreement is healthy. I just was doing some pre-work with a panel that's coming up, and I was asking them, so please send me your 3 points that you think the audience cares about, that doesn't know about. And then I structured some questions that we're going to be getting into, how to structure some questions. And I sent them out to the group and say, here's what I'm going to do for an agree, disagree kind of game. And one of the panelists came back and said, I really have an issue with where you're going with this. And I went, okay, we can talk about the process, but we are not going to have the panel discussion. Because he was thinking these questions needed to, like, everybody be in agreement.
Ooh,
and it's like,
boring.
It's like, no, I want there to be disagreement. That's why we have these agree, disagree panels, so that we can have an interesting discussion versus everybody doing the dashboard dog.
I 100% agree with you. In fact, I think the deadliest phrase in every panel is, I'd like to echo with what Kristin just said. It's like, well, then why are you there? Why are you there? In fact, so the technique that I have is to create exactly what you said, which is I call it the contrast. The contrast. There's multiple people on the panel because we want contrast. It's like, if they're saying the same thing, why are they both there? Like, we don't need one of them. There is like boring. So my thought is like, and it sounds weird to like say, I think the audience has high hopes and low expectations of panels.
Here's
agree.
A
panel. And they're like, oh, what's my high hope? I hope this is amazing. Like that one I remember from 2 conferences ago. What do I expect? I actually expect this to be boring.
And I'm going to sit on an aisle so that if it is boring, I can make a quick exit.
You can escape, yes. So the question is, how do you prevent with the very first question? Now, here is the traditional question. It's like almost all moderators who have not read your book and not studied your lessons here, what they're going to do is they're going to ask the world's most complex initial question. It's going to be something horrific like this, like, what do you think is the biggest, most common, and perhaps most dangerous financially oriented mistake that the majority of new managers make during their first 5 years that they should definitely consider avoiding if forewarned by more experienced or lay leaders or mentors in your organization? And please provide examples. Kristin. And the person,
what did you just say?
What? And it's like, what? Now the panelist doesn't want to say, I don't even remember what you just said, but it's like they're going to grab on a part and they're just going to give a word salad trying to provide value, because this is the first question. They're going to go blah, 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 blah. Now, if that isn't bad enough, then the moderator will go to the second panelist and say, same question, what do you think? I'm like, oh no. And so they're going to talk just as long as the first panelist, because they wouldn't want to say, well, basically she covered it. No, they have to provide their value and a little bit of dominance. So they're going to speak, and they're going to speak a little bit longer than the first panelist is. And now there's 3 people in the panel. You can't diss the third person. Oh, I guess you too. So what happens is the very first convoluted question creates this 3-part word salad that lasts for about 12 to 15 minutes. And at that moment, the audience is doing what I call the panel math. They ask one question. This is a 45-minute panel, and it's been 15 minutes. We're only going to get 3 questions. How can I escape now? So the solution is to ask a short, targeted question, get a short answer from the first person, jump in, get contrast for the second one, and possibly the third one. And I like to say in about 90 seconds, you can actually ask 1 primary and 3 follow-up questions with 2 or 3 panelists. It could be something like, okay, Kristin, what do you think is the biggest, most common mistakes new managers make? And you'll say, well, I think it's when they blah, 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 blah. And you take a breath. Great. Okay, so is that a financial or is that a social mistake, do you think, going on? Well, I think it's a social mistake. Excellent. Bob, do you think Kristin is right, or do you have a different one here? Well, I like some of those, but I would say actually the first mistake is blah, 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 blah. Okay, Bob, hold on. Mary, you've heard Kristin and Bob. Who's right, Barry or Bob, or is neither of them right? And this has been the first 90 seconds. You know what the audience is going? Yes. Yes, because we've heard contrast, and we said that the moderator is going to keep this thing moving, and that's what really gets things off to a powerful start.
That is an awesome opening. I think openings are super sticky. Like, they're really important because it tells the audience what to expect. Is this just going to be we're sitting back, or are we leaning in? Are we actually being asked to do anything? So tell us a little bit about what kinds of things you like to do as openers. Now that contrast one, I think you called it the contrast.
Oh, I like to call it start fast, give hope.
Start fast, give hope.
Give hope. And start fast, give hope. It's like we're so fast, we got a lot of responses, and just gave the audience hope. It's like, I think this is going to be an interesting panel because we already are getting disagreement. We're getting different stuff, and the moderator is driving this and not letting them just blather on with whatever. So I now have high hope. Another thing I like to do quickly is a technique that I call pull the panel. And pull the panel is where I said, okay, like, let's say we do the opening question. I said, okay, for this next, we're going to do a round of what I call pull the panel. Now, just saying a round of implies to the audience, suggests to the audience that there's going to be different rounds of questions. And so where I might have, it's like, okay, we're going to have the story answer round. We're going to have the pull the panel round. We're going to have the audience's control round. We're going to talk about financial questions round. I mean, so that the idea is that there's segments in this instead of just amorphous panel.
It's just a bunch of
questions. So I'd rather have 5 sections or rounds of 6 questions than just 30 questions. Because if like, okay, question 17, like, oh my gosh, I stopped caring after question 4. But it's like, okay, well, we're in a round. We got 5 questions around here. First question is boom. So a pull the panel is when I'm asking everybody in the panel gets to answer, but I'm controlling how they answer. So it's like, okay, everyone on the panel on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being it's a disaster and 10 being fantastic. How is the current marketing plan in your companies? 9, 7, 2. Wow, we're gonna have to follow you up there. It's like, okay, so what do you think about 8, 6, 4, 8, 8, 8, 7, 7, 7, 7, 1, 2. Really, 7, 1, 2. It's like, now I can go deeper on that. It's like, that's a pretty big gap here. So you're saying 7, Kristin. Why are you saying 7? It's like, okay, so you said 2, Bob. Why is Kristin's answer like 350% different from yours? Like, see, this is interesting. But everyone gets to respond. Now you can have other more clever type of things instead of 1 to 10. You could say, let's say you're talking about new managers and development or something like that. You have a panel of senior leaders within an organization. And so it's like, okay, I'm going to put a bunch of ideas out here like do stay interviews with your people or have one-on-ones or, take it to class or something like this. And I want you to say, is this something they should do next week, next month, or next year? And so suddenly it's like when you hear different answers from the different leaders, it's interesting. Or you could say something like, okay, I've done 2 things here. And this is, I would do later on to make something more playful and unexpected and fun. I have the 1 breath answer. So I go and say, okay, panelists, we're gonna have audience members ask you a question here, and you can answer for as long as you want in 1 breath. And as soon as you take a breath, I'm going to stop you. Now, they never believe that you're serious until the very first person goes, blah, 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 blah. And they went, no, that was your answer. But next person, next question. And they're like, oh my gosh, he's serious. She's serious. And then suddenly we're getting to humanize the panelists and showing that they're creative, funny, approachable, warm human beings, either an industry expert or a company leader. And people love that. Same type of question. I go the 5 answer. I said, okay, we're gonna ask you questions, and you can only answer in 5 words, and you can use your hands to keep track. And they're like, okay, what should I be doing now? Talk to peers about goals. Boom, good. Next one, it's like, know what goals are. Seriously. Okay, and so people are laughing. Now, again, if it was all this, that would be silly and stupid. But by mixing that in with more traditional questions, it changes the pace and makes the whole thing interesting.
Well, and I do think that there's something to be said about changing the pace every about 6 to 10 minutes in a panel. I believe in the segments piece, and that usually at the beginning of a segment is a nice way to transition into, doing something that makes people lean in and go, oh, this segment's going to be good versus, hey, it's time for a commercial break. Let's go check the refrigerator.
For sure. Now you suggested, or you mentioned, like, do we prepare the panelists ahead of time? Like, here are two formats called question formats that I totally prepare the panelists ahead of time for what's going to happen. One is what I call a story question. And a story question is, I said, I'm going to ask you a question that requires you to share an anecdote. So I'm going to say, who has an anecdote? And I'll give them a topic. And then I'll find out who has that. Who is the best one, and then I'll ask them that one. And I'll find who has the second one, and depending on how it goes, maybe we do that. Now, an example is, it'd be like, I like to say, tell us about a time when you, or give us an example of when you, or when did you find yourself in a position where you had to, see, no matter how they answer that question, they have to answer that in the story of an anecdote. And it could be something like, here's one I've actually used before with a group. I said, give us an example of when you posted something online professionally and it went bad. People could have took it the wrong way. You said something you shouldn't. You commented in other speakers' posts and they took offense, or you got trolled, or you got political. This could be on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, wherever. So give us an example of when you posted something online professionally and it went bad. Now, before we even get anyone to answer, what the audience is thinking? And then, again, sometimes I'll know who's going to answer. And sometimes I let them know that I'm going to ask this question. I don't know their answer, but I read their body language. And the panelists, and you see this.
I got one.
And I go, Bob, or Javier. It's like, Javier, okay. So our company had just done this thing, and blah, 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 blah. And then I post on blah, goes viral. And the CEO calls me. People are like, and then you can ask for the follow-up. It's like, well, Javier, I noticed that you're still working for the same company. So how did you survive? How did you bounce back from that? Well, okay. What I had to do was I went on, I called it the apology listening tour. And from that, actually, I discovered this. I became in charge of this project. I wound up getting promoted based on that thing, all because I totally blew it on the thing. And then as a moderator, I can say, so Javier, what you're saying is that no matter how bad you screw something up, sometimes that can be the seed of what grows to be a big career improvement. And you could just, people in the audience going, that's good. We talk about what went viral. It's like, instead of Javier just saying, in your career, it's important to not let your setbacks set you back, but use that as a platform for improvement. That's not sticking. No one will remember it. Yeah. But when Javier shares the example of posting something that went bad, almost getting fired, having to run around and talk to people on an apology tour, and then it leads into some insight, and then he teams with people, and he has a really successful project, and he makes the same point, everybody remembers that sticky point.
Yeah. Now, I love this notion of a story question, and I use it several times, and there's a particular time where I use it without it being on my agenda, is that if I think the panelists are staying too strategic, they're not bringing it down into application, they're not really thinking about the audience, even though we've coached them, think about the audience and what the audience needs to know. If they're still making it more kind of at their level versus what the audience needs, I'll then transition into a story question. So that's something to think about. The other thing that I wanted to ask you about is sometimes panelists can use up a lot of airtime to tell those stories and the follow-up questions. So what do you do to try to make sure that they stay concise?
Well, the great thing is that eventually they have to breathe, and there's a micro pause. And so in that first question, that where I said it's go for contrast, and then I quickly cut in and shift the question, add follow-up questions, I establish in an energetic, positive, respectful way that I'm going to interrupt them. Not in a mean way, not in a dismissive way, not appropriate, but in this enthusiastic way, because I'm supporting them and I'm supporting the audience. And I'll tell them ahead of time. It's like, okay, it's my job to be the audience's representative and be your best friend and protector. You are going to come across cooler, and so they know that. And so at different times, it's like, if I hear something, you say something that I think, that's really interesting, I'm going to jump in and ask you a follow-up or redirect, because I want you to keep going there, or I want you to shift to something, and they go, oh, okay. Now, if they know that I'm going to do that, so then I talked to, gosh, what was the guy's name? Was Bob? Do you remember what the guy's name was? I could jump in and say, actually doesn't remember his name, but what I think, you know what, everyone's interested in right now, they're saying, oh, tell me more about that. And they go, oh, okay. So the idea is I establish early that I will, and I use the term interject rather than interrupt because, you know, no one wants to be interrupted, to interject.
Well, and I love the fact that you're interjecting rather than to just, you know, flip it over to somebody else, is you're giving them kind of like some real-time coaching about where to focus their questions.
Yeah, get their answer because they've got a shared spill. Now, the other thing that I prepare the panelists for is this is almost the opposite thing you were talking about. Sometimes they get too strategic or high level and they don't get down to practical, tactical, I could do this stuff. Sometimes, and it sounds weird, they merely answer the question that was asked. This is especially true from when audience members ask a question, not when, of course, because we ask the best questions, right? If they've read your book, they will hopefully do that. But when it comes to audience members asking a question, they'll just answer that question. Now, we don't want them to be the politician answer. You know, thanks for that question. It reminds me of a story about my mother. It's like, that's not what they asked. Okay, but a technique that I will teach them is what I call the question behind the question. And I said, now this shows huge respect for the person answering the question, but shows why you were on this panel. Because you'll say, oh, yeah, thanks. What's your name? You know, Eduardo. Thank you, Eduardo, for asking that question. But here's the question behind that question. Like example, you were saying, what does the company have any new marketing strategies that we'll be hearing about soon? Here's the question behind that. Why are our sales so bad right now? That's what you really want to ask, isn't it? Like, well, it's like, that's fair. Anyone was thinking that? It's like, why are sales bad right now? It's like, no, I don't know if that'd be the actual question, but the idea is when someone says, yeah, it's like, but again, can you see what happened in a panel? Suddenly everyone would be like, what? The candor, the insight. When a leader says, here's what I'm going to do. It's like, I'm going to answer the question behind that question. Or the real question behind that question is this. It shows that they are listening and they're insightful, and this is why they are a vice president or a director or on the leadership team.
So just for clarity, you're suggesting that the panelists do this.
Yes.
And can the moderator do this as well?
Yes, that's a great question, because if a lot of times I will prep the panelists to do this, and if none of them are, because sometimes they don't do what we tell them to do, Kristin, it's so frustrating. Can you believe it? Sometimes they have minds of their own. So they're doing what they're going to do. And sometimes, again, part of our job is to protect the panelist or protect the organization that hired us to conduct this panel. And sometimes, you're right, as I will do that myself. It's like, okay, there's a question here. It's like, now, before you answer that question, I actually want to change these things up. If I could have your permission to do so. Well, what are they going to do? Say no? It's like,
yeah,
I think there's a question behind that question. And the real question is, why blah, 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 blah. And again, if you as a moderator have the skill to do that, which I hope there's a reason that you are a professional moderator. It's like that you do, is that you've done your homework. That shows your value to whoever hired you. It protects the panelists, it protects the company, and it also serves the audience better. This is, again, that virtuous circle of being a professional moderator. Now, if you do that more than twice, people are going to think you're just messing with them. But once or twice during every panel I ever moderate, I try to either have the panelists do that or I will do it. I said, actually, here, let's get to do the question behind the question. Now, once, just for fun, I tried this out and it worked pretty well. I told the audience in this next section, for the next 5 questions that you ask, you're going to ask your question, and then the panelist is going to say, I'm going to answer the question behind the question. They're going to tell you what that question is. Ooh. Now, that was different because, again, it showed that the panelists are truly experts at this and they truly know what's going on. Now, that's a little riskier thing. I would only do that with panelists that I thought had the skill to do that. But that makes that 4 questions or 5 questions really different because, again, that's what people want. This panel was amazing. What it was different than I expected and higher value than I expected. That's what amazing means.
So I'm also wondering, do you check in with the panelist who asked the original question and say, I don't remember who you said, Eduardo,
Yeah.
is that really your question behind the question? Or do you make that more of a rhetorical thing to the audience?
I tend to make it more of a rhetorical thing to audience. I seldom, if I'm the only one, in other words, there's a technique where what I'll call a panelist of one. A panelist of one is when you're doing Q&A with the audience yourself. Mm-hmm. And in that case, yes, you could do that because you're having I like to call it a one-on-one in front of everybody. But if I'm a moderator and there's a panelist, ain't nobody got time for that. We don't have time to suddenly, it's like, Eduardo, did you feel your question was answered? Really? Oh, did you want to respond to my rhetorical question? Apparently it's not a rhetorical question. Now I have to have a conversation with you. And unless Eduardo says, heck yeah, this is not actually a good question for me to ask. So no, I don't.
So audience Q&A, how do you set that up so that there are some understood ground rules for the audience?
All right. So one is you give different ways of giving people choice. In other words, what I like to do is have multiple ways of having audience members get to ask questions. So one is sometimes it's controlling how they can ask the question. And it could be, it's like, okay, so you can ask any question you want as long as it's in 2 sentences or less. You can ask any questions you want as long as X, as long as it's about this. It can only be a one-part question. Now, that could be more control-oriented. The other type of thing is I like to give what I call the audience is the people's choice. And I said, it's like, okay, I'm putting 3 questions up on the screen here. The audience using their phones or remotes or their hands votes on which question we're going to ask and which panelists we're going to ask. Now, the odds are, or the deal is, I've put only questions that the panelists are comfortable answering anyways, but the audience feels we're in control and we get to decide, and so it's very interactive for them. Other times I'll also do a gimmick just to mix it up where the way of figuring out who's going to ask the question is actually a more interesting thing. I might take a foam ball or a foam frisbee and say, it's like, okay, it's time for foam frisbee Q&A. I'm going to take the foam frisbee, I'm going to fling it into the audience. Whoever catches it or it lands next to, congratulations, you're answering the question, and we'll rush a handheld mic to you. And just do that. They tend to ask non-rambling questions. The only audience questions that we want to avoid are the long, rambling, I've got an axe to grind question. And that happens when we say, line up behind the microphones and ask a question. I can guarantee if you do that format, someone's going to run right up there. And it's like, oh, I've got the microphone. Oh, Chris, I'm really glad I got this opportunity to ask you a question because, I've been working for the company for 42 years, even though I'm only 26. And I've noticed this one thing has been really bothering me. And are you with me? Is everyone else bothering with me too? It's like, oh my gosh, you've completely ceded control. So that's why it's my thought is you got to control how the audience asks the questions, give them a variety of ways. And sometimes the idea simply is put it on a card and have them print. And then I can read it. I can say, we've got a couple of questions here that are basically the same question here. And so I've combined them together, and then you ask it in an intelligible way.
Yeah. I mean, I think the idea is that you really think through the best ways to get questions from the audience. It could be, written questions. It could be raise your hand, roam around the room. It could be a microphone. But that you create an environment where those are going to be quickly expressed. Like it just drives me nuts when somebody says, Brian, I really appreciate you taking the time to be here with us. Like, I know how busy it's like, we don't care. Yeah. Start with your name, maybe what department you're from or what company, where are you located, 1, 2 things. And then what is your question? And I tell people, if you do not start with a question, I will politely cut you off, and then maybe 1 sentence is a follow-up and then you're done. Sit down. We're going to then have a conversation about the answer to your question. So I'm a big fan of ground rules for Q&A.
Here's the simplest ground rule for your question. It's why do we? Why don't we? So it's like you can come in your question here. You can ask them any question you want, but the question has to be, why do we X? Why don't we Y? That's it. Could be anything you want, but why do we? Not explanation. It's like, why do we charge customers extra when they want to escalate a problem within our call center? Why don't we bundle our two newest products together so for a longer commitment period? Like, those are great questions. Now, again, the nature of the question, by controlling, saying, here's how you can answer the question, prevents it from being a long rambling thing, and it allows the people to answer. And so that's like, by giving them, it's like, you could, I think you want, it's like, why do we? Why don't we? Everyone understand? Here's an example. Okay, go. And then if person say, so my question is about the blah, blah, blah. So you see, I'm the head of the, you got to jump to, it's like, what's your name? Javier. Great, right? Are you doing a why do we or why don't we? Why don't we? Great. Okay, go ahead and ask that why don't we?
Yeah.
And then,
I think that works really well for corporate or town hall meetings.
Yeah.
I'm going to have to think about this one, Brian, about some other versions for like associations and homogenous and non-homogenous groups. You've got me thinking on that one. Ooh, this is dangerous.
a great one is framing something with what I call the hot seat. For example, if I'm doing a thing for an association, again, the first time I did this was for a company that was in trouble, and they just got a new CEO. It's kind of what I'll call the savior CEO complex. So it's like, okay, we're going down the tubes. Things are bad. We're going to be selling plants. But, Philip is going to come in. He's our new CEO. And so I was talking with them, and I said, it's like, okay, people are skeptical. People are doubting. And so we're going to have a Q&A, and it would be great if we can call it the hot seat. So we framed it. And we said, it's like, okay, Phil and the entire leadership team here. I said, we're calling this segment the Q&A hot seat. We're going to ask you to come up with the sharpest questions that should make them squirm. And they said, we will answer every single question, but you have to write them down on the flame red 3x5 card, and you have to print it so I can read it. And so I had people, of course, putting it in, handing it out to me. And so it said, okay, Phil, here's the question. And he would decide as the CEO, is he going to answer the question, or he will have one of his senior leaders answer it. And then the joke would be that each of them got one pass card. And if they didn't want to answer that question, then Phil had to answer the question. So suddenly you have intense questions, but you have humor and you have choices. And so they'd be like, it's like, are we going to be closing down the plant here? Blah, blah, blah. And it's like, wow. It's like, okay, Phil, it's like, well, are we going to have our senior vice president of, manufacturing answer that, question here? And it's like, okay, so we have no plans at this time. And then Phil's like, okay, that's a weasel answer, isn't it? And people are clap, 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 clap. The weasel answers, we're looking at right now, we're going to know in about a month. Yeah. That's the truth. Yeah. And people are like, okay. And they stood there and they answered every single question. And when it was done, people are like, we didn't like all the answers, but man, do we respect them. They stood there and they took it and they answered the question, and the credibility that they had. And that was a panel that that was sticky. And it's interesting because we repeated that format for the next 3 years in a row, but it wasn't as cool for the next 2 years because things got better and better. But so it's good. So it got better. They didn't close the plants, but again, sometimes, that's a way of framing something as we're going to do a hot seat where things are intentionally supposed to be there.
So, Brian, how did you get everybody on that leadership team to agree to squirm?
All I needed to do was get the CEO to agree that was the right thing to do, and he told them.
Okay.
Yeah. So sometimes that one was, it's like, okay, here's the CEO coming in. As a moderator of this panel, it's my job to support the company, in this case, the person who hired me, and she's saying that here's what the CEO cares about. And so it's like, okay, Mr. CEO, in this case, it was him. It's like, if we do the panel this way, it will reinforce that you are a candid leader who tells the truth and is not afraid of any question. This was a guy who wanted to be an alpha male type of guy, and so that fit his personality. And I said, but here's the deal. It's got to be true for everybody on the team, and if anybody gives a weaselly answer, then you've got to say, no, you got to do that straight. And he's like, done. And I said, okay. So, and then when I briefed them ahead of time, I said, okay, here's where we can call this a hot seat here. Here's how it's going to work. And Phil, I just want to make sure that like, this is how you want this thing to go. And he's like, bleep right, bleepity bleep right. This is how we're going to do it. And so we made sure that the first question went to Phil because he set the tone, and then it gave courage to the rest of the senior leaders to not answer in a PC sort of way.
Awesome. Well, Brian, I think we could probably go on and on and on. We've been going for about 45 minutes, and
it's not a 3-hour podcast.
It's not a 3-hour podcast, but hey, we could keep talking. I would love to have you on again. So if there's one thing that you want our listeners, viewers to take away to help their panels be super sticky, what would be the one thing?
The one thing is to get panelists to say, here is what they don't know that when they do know will make the difference. In every question, what does the audience not know that when they do know will be the difference? So if you go to them and you say, okay, the question is this, and here are the 3 things I could say here. Do they know those things? Well, yeah. Okay.
They should.
Okay. They should. So, what do they not know? Is there any, and here's a question that I like to ask. Is there any of these answers to any of these questions that will make the audience gasp? And when they go, no. And I said, what question could you give an answer to that would make the audience gasp?
In either a good way or a bad way.
Either way. And they're actually not going to do it. And usually they would say, well, that one question here, if you asked it this way, I would actually need to answer it like this. And they would be like, whoa. And it could be whoa or what or OMG or WTF or whatever their response is going to be. It's like, yes, because that is sticky. And that type of answer. Now, you could ask all these questions that are really good. But again, there's that big moment when Javier said this, when Mary said that. You saw people like, I can't believe she actually told us. It's like, and that will be talked about through the entire conference. And the panel will be more memorable than the keynote that you paid $20,000 for.
Awesome. Well, Brian Walter, founder of Extreme Meetings and Sticky Training, I am so excited to have you here. And will you come back again?
Absolutely. You ring and I will come.
You are awesome. And if anybody's looking for anyone who just makes events rock, this would be my friend and colleague, Brian Walter. Thank you so much. You've been awesome. Every time I listen to you, I always pick up something new, even though I've written about most of these techniques.
Yes.
And it's like, oh yeah, there's still something there that's a good there's a iteration. And I think that that's part of our role, is to try things out with audiences and keep it fresh, even for ourselves, and to just have this kind of treasure trove of different techniques that we can pull and use. So thank you so much, Brian, for sharing your wisdom. And thank you, listeners and viewers, for subscribing to this podcast, listening to this podcast. Please subscribe if you haven't. And we will see you the next time I put one of these out. How's that sound?
Could be anytime.
Could be anytime. Thanks so much, Brian. Have a great day.